The invasion came without warning. On a Tuesday morning in March 2387, the skies above every major population center on Earth darkened simultaneously as massive ships materialized through what our scientists would later understand to be dimensional fold technology. The vessels were unlike anything in human imagination, organic in appearance yet clearly technological, pulsing with an inner light that seemed to mock our primitive understanding of physics. Within 72 hours, every government on Earth had either surrendered or been reduced to radioactive ash. The hegemony, as they called themselves, made their intentions clear through broadcasts transmitted directly into every electronic device on the planet. Humanity was to be catalogued, processed, and integrated into their vast empire as a laborer species. Resistance would result in planetary sterilization. The initial shock paralyzed most of civilization. Cities burned not from alien weapons, but from the chaos of 7 billion people suddenly realizing they were no longer the apex species on their own world. The hegemony's forces moved with surgical precision, establishing collection centers in every major urban area. Their soldiers, if they could be called that, were a horrifying fusion of organic and mechanical components, standing 3 meters tall with appendages that could reconfigure themselves for any task from construction to execution. Marcus Chen, formerly of the Beijing Institute of Technology, recorded his observations during the first week of occupation. They moved through our cities like farmers inspecting livestock. There's no malice in their actions, no apparent joy or satisfaction. We are simply a resource to be harvested and processed. The clinical efficiency of their operations is perhaps more terrifying than any display of brutality could have been. The processing began immediately. Humans were sorted by physical capability, intellectual capacity, and psychological profile. The strong were shipped off-world to mining colonies and construction projects on barren planets whose names we never learned. The intellectually gifted found themselves conscripted into research facilities where they were forced to solve problems for technologies beyond their understanding. Children were separated from parents and placed in conditioning centers where their minds were gradually reshaped to accept servitude as the natural order. Yet even in those darkest early days, something extraordinary was happening beneath the surface of humanity's apparent capitulation. In the underground tunnels of abandoned subway systems, in the basements of ruined buildings, in the forgotten corners of a broken world, humans were adapting. The same species that had once conquered every environment on their planet, from the deepest oceans to the highest peaks, was learning to survive under the yoke of an alien empire. Maria Santos, a former engineering professor from Sao Paulo, became one of the first to document the underground resistance networks. We learned to communicate through vibrations in the metal infrastructure. The hegemony monitored all electromagnetic communications, but they never thought to listen to the pipes and support beams. We developed a language of taps and clicks that could carry complex information across entire city blocks. Children who had been released from conditioning centers taught us what they had learned about hegemony technology and psychology. Every small act of defiance, every rescued human, every sabotaged operation was a victory against their assumption that we were merely cattle to be managed. The hegemony's fundamental mistake was in their assessment of human nature. Their own species, a collective consciousness that had absorbed dozens of other races over millennia, operated on principles of hierarchical efficiency and logical submission. They could not comprehend a species that grew stronger under pressure, more creative when constrained, and more unified when threatened. Every attempt to break human spirit only served to forge it into something harder and more resilient. The turning point came in the third year of occupation. In the ruins of what had once been Geneva, a group of captured scientists led by Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a quantum physicist who had been forced to work on hegemony dimensional technology, made a discovery that would change the course of human history. While analyzing the power cores of their captors' equipment, Dr. Tanaka realized that the same dimensional fold technology that had enabled the invasion had a critical vulnerability. The mathematics were elegant in their simplicity. Once we understood the underlying principles, Dr. Tanaka recorded in her secret logs, the hegemony's dimensional manipulation required a quantum resonance field that maintained coherence across multiple reality layers. But every field has its harmonic frequency, and every harmonic frequency has its opposite. We didn't need to build weapons to match their technology. We needed to build tuning forks. The discovery spread through the resistance networks like wildfire. In hidden workshops carved out of sewer systems and abandoned buildings, humans began constructing devices that could disrupt hegemony technology at the quantum level. The process required materials that were difficult to obtain and expertise that few possessed, but humanity had always excelled at solving impossible problems with insufficient resources. The first successful test occurred in the industrial district of Detroit, where a cell of resistance fighters had managed to construct a prototype disruption device. When activated, the device created a localized field that caused hegemony equipment to malfunction catastrophically. Their soldiers, dependent on their technological enhancements, found themselves suddenly vulnerable. For the first time since the invasion, humans killed their oppressors. But the hegemony's response was swift and brutal. The entire Detroit region was subjected to what their records called comprehensive sterilization. Every living thing within a 50-kilometer radius was reduced to molecular dust. The message was clear: resistance would be met with genocide. This moment represented the crucible of human evolution. Faced with the choice between submission and extinction, humanity chose a third option: transformation. The survivors of Detroit's destruction were not broken by the loss of their city and their friends. Instead, they were galvanized by the proof that their enemy could be hurt. If the hegemony felt the need to respond so drastically to a single successful attack, it meant they were afraid. The resistance networks evolved into something the hegemony could not have anticipated. Human cells began operating with a level of coordination and sacrifice that bordered on the supernatural. Individuals would willingly walk into certain death if it meant advancing the cause by even the smallest degree. Parents would send their children into danger to carry messages. Elderly humans would volunteer for suicide missions to provide distractions for larger operations. Dr. Amara Okafor, a psychologist who studied the resistance networks, observed, "We were witnessing the emergence of a collective consciousness that maintained individual identity while serving a greater purpose. Unlike the hegemony's forced unity, ours was chosen." Every human in the resistance understood that they were part of something larger than themselves, but they also understood that their individual actions mattered. This paradox, unity without loss of self, became our greatest strength. The development of what came to be known as the Liberation Protocol began in year 4 of the occupation. The protocol was not just a military strategy, but a comprehensive transformation of human civilization. Every aspect of human society, science, culture, psychology, and philosophy, was reimagined around the principle of adaptive resilience. Children born in the underground resistance communities were raised from birth to understand both their individual worth and their collective responsibility. They learned mathematics alongside stealth techniques, studied literature while training in guerrilla warfare, and developed artistic expression as a form of coded communication. These children, who would later be known as the Phoenix Generation, represented humanity's answer to the hegemony's attempt at cultural genocide. The technological breakthrough that made liberation possible came from an unexpected source. Dr. James O'Brien, an atmospheric scientist who had been working in one of the hegemony's research facilities, discovered that their dimensional fold technology was vulnerable to interference from what humans called emotional resonance fields. The hegemony, being a purely logical collective, had never encountered a species that could generate measurable quantum effects through emotional states. They thought our emotional nature was a weakness, Dr. O'Brien recorded. They saw our capacity for love, anger, hope, and despair as inefficient evolutionary artifacts. But emotions are not separate from consciousness. They are consciousness expressing itself through quantum interactions with reality. When humans experience intense emotional states in coordination with others, we create localized alterations in the fabric of space-time itself. The hegemony's technology, designed to maintain rigid quantum stability, cannot adapt to these fluctuations. The implications were staggering. Not only could humans disrupt hegemony technology through technological means, but they could also interfere with it through coordinated emotional experiences. Love, properly focused and shared among groups of humans, could disable their weapons. Righteous anger, channeled through trained individuals, could overload their dimensional drives. Hope, maintained against all logical evidence, could create quantum instabilities that made their ships crash. The first large-scale test of emotion-based resistance occurred in the ruins of London, where 10,000 humans had been gathered for processing and shipment off-world. As the hegemony transport ships prepared to depart, the prisoners, acting on signals distributed through the resistance networks, began to sing. Not any particular song, but a harmony that emerged spontaneously from their shared experience of loss and hope. The quantum resonance created by 10,000 human voices raised in unified defiance caused every hegemony ship in a 50-kilometer radius to experience critical system failures. Transport vessels crashed, guard units collapsed as their technological enhancements failed, and for the first time in 4 years, a significant population of humans was free. But the London Liberation, as it came to be known, represented more than just a tactical victory. It demonstrated that humanity's greatest strength lay not in matching their oppressors' technology, but in transcending the very paradigm that made oppression possible. The hegemony ruled through the principle that superior force could subjugate any inferior species. Humanity proved that no force, no matter how superior, could subjugate a species that refused to accept the legitimacy of subjugation itself. The final phase of the Liberation Protocol began in Year 6 of the occupation. By this point, the resistance had evolved into a shadow civilization that existed alongside and within the hegemony's control structures. Humans worked in alien facilities by day and planned revolution by night. Children attended conditioning sessions while secretly learning the techniques that would free their minds. Scientists solved problems for their captors while simultaneously developing the technologies that would destroy them. The hegemony, for all their technological superiority, could not comprehend the depth of human duplicity. Their own species was incapable of maintaining contradictory thoughts or behaviors, so they assumed that humans who appeared to be complying were actually complying. They failed to understand that humans could simultaneously cooperate with and resist the same system, maintaining perfect surface conformity while building perfect internal rebellion. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a xenopsychologist who had infiltrated the hegemony's command structure, provided crucial intelligence about their decision-making processes. They operate on pure logical optimization. Every decision is made to maximize efficiency and minimize resource expenditure. They cannot conceive of a strategy that appears to be counterproductive in the short term but serves a larger purpose over time. This blind spot became our greatest advantage. While they focused on immediate compliance metrics, we were building the foundations of long-term liberation. The revolution itself lasted exactly 72 hours, the same duration as the original invasion. It began simultaneously on every world where humans had been enslaved, coordinated through quantum entanglement communication networks that the resistance had developed using stolen hegemony technology. The signal that started the uprising was not transmitted through any electronic medium, but through the quantum field fluctuations created by coordinated human consciousness. On mining colonies in distant star systems, human workers suddenly turned their tools into weapons. On research stations orbiting gas giants, human scientists triggered cascading failures in dimensional fold generators that tore holes in space-time itself. On Earth, the resistance networks emerged from their hiding places like antibodies attacking an infection, moving with a precision and coordination that made the hegemony's military efficiency look clumsy by comparison. The key to the revolution's success was its embrace of what military historians would later call asymmetric transcendence. Instead of attempting to defeat the hegemony through conventional means, humans attacked the conceptual foundations of their empire. Every hegemony installation was not merely destroyed, but transformed into a monument to the impossibility of permanent subjugation. Every captured alien was not killed, but educated about the principles of individual consciousness and free will. The hegemony's response followed their established patterns. They attempted to implement comprehensive sterilization protocols for every world where humans had rebelled, but the liberation forces had anticipated this reaction and developed countermeasures based on their understanding of dimensional fold technology. As hegemony ships prepared to execute entire populations, human technicians activated devices that redirected the sterilization energy through dimensional portals, sending it harmlessly into empty space. The psychological impact on the hegemony collective was immediate and catastrophic. For the first time in their species' history, they had encountered a problem that could not be solved through the application of superior force or technological advantage. Worse, they had encountered a species that seemed to grow stronger when subjected to pressure, more creative when constrained, and more unified when threatened. The final confrontation occurred not on any battlefield, but in the quantum dimensional space where the hegemony maintained their collective consciousness. A team of human volunteers led by Dr. Tanaka and Dr. O'Brien used modified dimensional fold technology to project their individual consciousnesses directly into the hegemony's shared mental space. What they found there defied every expectation. The hegemony collective consciousness was not the vast, powerful entity that had conquered dozens of worlds. but a frightened remnant of species that had long ago abandoned their individual identity in exchange for the illusion of security. They had become parasites, feeding on the creative energy of other species because they had forgotten how to generate it themselves. "We expected to find an enemy," Dr. Tanaka recorded after the expedition. "Instead, we found victims." The hegemony had enslaved other species not out of malice or superiority, but out of desperate need. They had traded their capacity for growth, change, and individual consciousness for stability and collective security. In doing so, they had become dependent on harvesting those qualities from others. We realized that defeating them would not be enough. We would have to heal them. The solution that emerged from this revelation represented the pinnacle of human moral and intellectual evolution. Rather than destroying the hegemony collective, humanity chose to rehabilitate it. Using the same emotional resonance techniques that had disrupted their technology, human volunteers began projecting experiences of individual consciousness, creative joy, and personal growth directly into the collective mind. The process took months and required thousands of human volunteers to maintain constant mental contact with the hegemony consciousness. Many of these volunteers suffered permanent psychological damage from prolonged exposure to the alien collective, but gradually, the hegemony began to remember what they had lost when they abandoned individual identity. The transformation was not instant or complete. The hegemony collective consciousness began to fragment as individual personalities reasserted themselves for the first time in millennia. Some fragments could not adapt to individual existence and simply dissipated. Others emerged as confused, childlike entities that required extensive care and education. But a core group of hegemony individuals not only survived the transition but embraced it with the enthusiasm of beings who had rediscovered the meaning of life itself. The liberated hegemony individuals became humanity's first alien allies, bringing with them technologies and knowledge that advanced human civilization by centuries in mere decades. But more importantly, they became living proof that the principles humanity had discovered during their enslavement, the power of individual consciousness within collective purpose, the strength that emerged from chosen unity rather than imposed conformity, the creative potential that flourished under pressure, were not merely human traits but universal principles of conscious evolution. The reconstruction of human civilization began immediately after the liberation, but this was not merely a return to pre-invasion conditions. The 7 years of enslavement had fundamentally transformed humanity, creating a species that was simultaneously more individualistic and more collectively conscious than ever before. The Phoenix generation, those children born and raised in the resistance, became the architects of this new civilization. They had grown up understanding that individual excellence and collective responsibility were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of conscious evolution. Under their guidance, human society reorganized itself around principles that would have seemed impossible before the invasion. Cities were rebuilt as adaptive organisms, with infrastructure that could reconfigure itself in response to changing needs. Education systems were redesigned to foster both individual creativity and collective wisdom. Economic structures evolved to reward innovation and cooperation equally. Political systems emerged that could maintain stable governance while remaining flexible enough to adapt to new challenges instantly. But perhaps the most significant change was in humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. The invasion had shattered the illusion that humans were alone or unique, but the liberation had revealed something far more profound. Consciousness itself was the fundamental creative force in the universe, and any species that learned to harness this force responsibly could transcend any limitation. Dr. Elena Vasquez, in her role as chief historian of the Reconstruction Authority, summarized this transformation in her final report. The hegemony believed they had discovered a species suitable for exploitation and integration into their empire. Instead, they had encountered a force of nature that they could neither understand nor contain. Humanity's enslavement lasted exactly 7 years, but our education in the true nature of conscious evolution will continue for generations to come. We entered this trial as a single species, confined to one world. We emerged as the guardians of a universal principle that applies to all conscious beings everywhere. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This ancient wisdom, carved into monuments throughout the reconstructed Earth, became the philosophical foundation of post-liberation humanity. The weak self that humanity destroyed during those 7 years was not physical weakness or intellectual limitation, but the assumption that survival required submission to superior force. By refusing to accept this assumption, humans had discovered that consciousness itself was the only truly superior force in the universe. The liberation of humanity was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter in the evolution of consciousness throughout the galaxy. Human exploration fleets, accompanied by their reformed hegemony allies, began seeking out other enslaved species and sharing the techniques of liberation they had developed. The principles discovered during Earth's darkest period became tools for the emancipation of countless worlds. Each species they encountered required different approaches. Some needed technological assistance to overcome their oppressors. Others required educational programs to rebuild confidence in their own capabilities. Still others needed only the example of successful resistance to inspire their own liberation movements. But in every case, the fundamental principle remained the same. No conscious being could be permanently enslaved as long as they retained the capacity to choose their own response to circumstances. The network of liberated worlds that emerged from these efforts became known as the Consciousness Collaborative, a voluntary association of species united not by common government or shared technology, but by commitment to the principle that consciousness was the birthright of all sentient beings. The collaborative had no central authority, no mandatory membership requirements, and no standardized systems of governance. What it had instead was a shared understanding that diversity of thought, experience, and approach was essential to the continued evolution of consciousness itself. Years passed, and the memory of enslavement began to fade into history for many humans. But the institutions and principles born from that experience continued to shape human civilization in profound ways. The resistance networks evolved into global communication systems that could adapt to any disruption. The underground workshops became research centers that specialized in solving impossible problems with insufficient resources. The emotional resonance techniques became forms of artistic expression that could create measurable changes in physical reality. The children who grew up hearing stories of the liberation, the second Phoenix generation, carried forward the lessons their parents had learned through suffering, but applied them to challenges of creation rather than survival. They developed technologies that seemed to border on magic, created art that could alter consciousness across species barriers, and explored philosophical questions that previous generations had never imagined possible. But they also maintained the vigilance that their parents had learned through bitter experience. The universe was vast, and consciousness faced many threats beyond simple enslavement. There were forces that sought to eliminate diversity in favor of uniformity, entities that fed on the creative energy of growing civilizations, and phenomena that could trap entire species in cycles of stagnation and decline. The Terran Liberation Command, evolved from the original resistance networks, became humanity's early warning system against these threats. Its agents operated throughout the galaxy, not as conquerors or controllers, but as gardeners tending to the growth of consciousness wherever it appeared. They shared knowledge freely, offered assistance without expectation of reward, and intervened only when asked or when extinction-level threats emerged. Dr. Chen, now in his final years, reflected on the transformation he had witnessed. We spent so much energy during the occupation trying to preserve what we had been, never realizing that what we were becoming was infinitely more valuable. The humans who emerged from liberation were not the same species that had been conquered. We had evolved, not biologically, but consciously. We had learned to be simultaneously individual and collective, peaceful and warrior-like, creative and practical, humble and confident. These apparent contradictions, which would have seemed impossible before the invasion, became the source of our greatest strength. The liberation of humanity ultimately proved that consciousness could not be contained by any external force, no matter how technologically advanced or strategically superior, but it also proved something more profound, that the attempt to enslave consciousness inevitably strengthened it, refined it, and prepared it for greater challenges and greater achievements. The weak self that humanity destroyed during its 7 years of enslavement was the part that believed survival required submission, that security required conformity, and that strength required the suppression of others. In destroying this weak self, humanity had discovered its true nature as a force for conscious evolution throughout the universe. The legacy of those 7 years continued to ripple outward through space and time, touching civilizations that had not yet been born and inspiring forms of consciousness that had not yet evolved. The story of humanity's enslavement and liberation became a galactic legend, passed down through thousands of species as proof that no darkness was permanent, no oppression was absolute, and no limitation was final. In the end, the hegemony had been correct about one thing. Humanity was indeed suitable for integration into their empire. What they had failed to understand was that this integration would not involve humanity becoming like them, but rather them becoming more like humanity. The empire they had built through conquest and subjugation was transformed into a collaborative network dedicated to the flourishing of consciousness in all its forms. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This principle, learned through suffering and proven through triumph, became humanity's gift to the universe. It was a gift that could not be stolen, could not be hoarded, and could not be used for oppression. It could only be shared, and in the sharing multiplied until it reached every corner of existence where consciousness struggled to understand its own infinite potential. The document concludes with a note from the Terran archives. This historical record is preserved not as a monument to human superiority, but as evidence of a universal principle. Consciousness, when faced with extinction, does not merely survive, it evolves. The species that emerged from humanity's trial by fire was not superior to what came before, but it was more complete, more aware of its own nature and potential. This transformation is available to any conscious being willing to destroy their weak self in service of their true nature. The choice, as always, remains with each individual consciousness to make for itself. Thus ends the historical record of humanity's 7-year enslavement and the liberation that followed. It stands as testimony to the indomitable nature of consciousness itself, and as a guide for any species that may face similar trials in the cosmic future that stretches endlessly ahead.